Let me welcome you today to this second lesson of how to avoid life's pitfalls. Coming out of Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 12. The pitfalls of temptation. The point today, remember what is at stake helps us overcome temptation. Who's in charge? Can you count the cost? Does it fit God's standard? We all wonder at what lies ahead in our life. There's many things that we don't understand. We can't see far enough down the road to comprehend the circumstances of life that we may have to face. Joseph was on a journey, betrayed by his brothers, sold to be a slave. Can you imagine all of what was going through his mind during this journey down into Egypt? Joseph had to remember what was at stake in his life, his character, his reputation. He was his son's favorite son. So his conversations to God on this journey was some of the most important prayers of his life. Joseph had to come to forgive his brother for what they had done to him. Joseph did not know what would become of his life, what the outcome was going to look like. He had dreams, but how was those dreams going to happen now? He was going to be a slave to someone. Luke 12:29 through 32 says, "And seek not what you shall eat, or what you shall drink, neither be ye doubtful minded. For all of these things do the nation of the world seek after. And your Father knoweth that you have need of these things. But seek ye the kingdom of God, and all of these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." See, God wants to bless our lives. And we must remember that God has chose us. God can be trusted. And God will always provide and meet our greatest needs. And one of our greatest needs is forgiveness. But I want you to know today that Satan is real. He's not your friend. And he's out to hurt you. As John 10:10 says, he came to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And he will use every means possible to make that happen. And in our life, we must let Jesus take the wheel of our life. I know that we like to think that we're in control of our lives, but we must remember we must surrender to his authority. Stop complaining and whining about how bad our life is, and make the best of what God has given us. Then we won't have no regrets or say, why did I give in? Why did I do that? We must remember what's at stake. We're not alone. And God will always help guide and direct our feet to the life that will fit his plan. And when we fall, or temptation comes, it's not the fall that defines us, it's how you respond that will define your character. In verse 1, "And Joseph was brought down into Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guards, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither." The Ishmaelites had brought Joseph down into Egypt. But I want you to know today, as Christians, we must be aware when things are going well in our lives. I want you to know today, we also should rejoice in the blessings from God that we receive. But we should never drop our guard against the pitfall of temptation. Joseph had arrived in Egypt. His brothers had sold him to the traders of the Ishmaelites on their way down to Egypt. And after they got there, they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Now Joseph went from being a favorite son to becoming a slave to a stranger named Potiphar, which was a high-ranking officer to Pharaoh. Now Potiphar had responsibilities as a captain of the guards, and so as a high-rank officer, it underscored his loyalty to Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh would only place his personal guards in the hand of a captain that would have complete trust in, someone that he completely trusts. And so his role as captain of the guards, it allowed Potiphar to make wise choices about who was under his command. This allowed him to be able to judge soldiers' potential or guards' potentials. And perhaps for that reason alone, he bought Joseph to be one of his slaves. He seen potential. He looked like a great promise. Verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now Joseph had no family with him at this time, no coat to make him feel special. In fact, he had nothing from his homeland to remind him of his past life, but God. He had been replaced into a strange country, a different language that was all different to him. Everything was new. He had seemed to have lost everything that was important to him. Listen, he had the Lord with him. God had not forgotten about him. God knew what Joseph had to give up. He knew what he was facing. See, our pitfalls and our circumstances and our troubles don't tell our story of our life. But the way we respond to those situations and those circumstances will define our true character. Jesus says in Mark 11:22, have faith in God. Because of Joseph's faith, God blessed him. He was a prosperous man. Joseph did not understand God's plan for his life at this time, but he knew enough about God to let God have control, have the will of his life. God knew Joseph's life, and he worked in Joseph's life in keeping that plan, all while he's in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord had made all that he did to prosper in his hands. Joseph began to work in his master's house. Potiphar had been watching him. He had been observing his work. He had noticed that everything that he touched, it was prosperous, and every task that he was given, or every assignment that he was taken, it come out better than it was before. Potiphar also noticed the link between Joseph's success and the presence of the Lord in his life. Look, it's something to say that we have God with us, but it's another thing to prove that. When we show the world who is watching that he's alive in our hearts and our lives, that he's real. Potiphar saw the Lord was with him. Look, Joseph's life would have turned out totally different if he had continued to hold grudges and hatred for his brothers. It would have been a different world for him. Verse 4, it says, and Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him and made him an overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hands. Joseph made a positive impression, a positive impact on Potiphar with his work ethic, his devotion to the Lord, and for that reason, Joseph had found grace in his sight. Potiphar had seen that Joseph could be trusted. Still a slave, he gave him more responsibility. This new responsibility was to make him an overseer over his house, and all that he had, he put it into the hands of Joseph. Being an overseer meant that he had to manage Potiphar's personal resources as well as the people that he would assign to work in his home or his house. And Joseph continued to serve him, and he continued to make a great impression in Potiphar's life, to a point that he allowed him to be in charge of everything that he owned. Potiphar had entrusted it all into Joseph's hands. Joseph was now learning and growing for the bigger picture that God had in mind for Joseph's life. In verse 5, and it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the fields. Now, after Joseph had been given more responsibility, Potiphar had continued to observe his work. And he managed Potiphar's household, and the Lord had blessed Potiphar with more resources for Joseph to manage. This was a setup for what was to come. See, God's hand was upon the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Potiphar had benefited from all of this. Joseph benefited from this as well. Potiphar lived with a satisfaction that came with growth from personal wealth, while Joseph enjoyed the comfort that came with satisfying his master, being pleasing to his master. Not only did everything go well for Potiphar in his house, but even in the fields, they prospered under Joseph's management of Potiphar's entire estate. God had blessed Potiphar in keeping that decision to look with favor upon Joseph. See, but God had a bigger picture in mind when he said this. Another important reason that God was blessing Potiphar's house and his businesses because generations earlier, God had told Abraham that he would bless them who blessed Abraham and his family. And God was keeping his promise for that very reason too. In verse 6, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person, and well favored. God had blessed Potiphar's house that Joseph had managed for him. Potiphar now could enjoy his life. He didn't have to worry about daily operations or his personal business or his investments, because he had left everything in his life in Joseph's care, which allowed him to be free, that he could turn his attention to something else that needed to be done if there was something. See, he had no needs or concerns for anything anymore except for the very bread which he did eat each day. Now, everything was going good for Joseph too. He had also earned grace and respect, and most importantly, trust from his master, because he was well favored. See, this was a kind of son that Joseph always wanted to be. Someone who could be trusted, honorable, and respected. In verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. When things seem to be going good and everything is well, we must beware, because Satan is watching. He's on the prowl. He's like a roaring lion looking for a weakness. Potiphar's wife had took notice of Joseph as well. See, Joseph had become an object of lust in her eyes. James 1:14 said, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And this is what happened to Potiphar's wife. She was enticed by her own lust. Potiphar's wife had committed sin in her eyes that infected her heart. Joseph had managed the household affairs, so it's likely that he had to work and talk to her at some point with issues maybe related to the house. Joseph had been a good, godly person. He was young and well-favored. Got her attention. It fed her lust. And the more she looked at him, the more she wanted to lie with him. She just wanted to lie with him with the intentions of going a little farther by committing adultery. At this point, she had already committed adultery in her heart. So she had made him an invitation to lie with her. Now Joseph never, at one time, he never pursued her. She was the one pursuing him because her eyes was upon him. In verse 8, but he refused, and he said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master willeth not what is with me in thy house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hands. Today, when we experience temptation, we must have our standards and conviction already in place, being sanctified and set apart from this world in which we live. See, that moral standards we set, it comes to rescue us and deliver us from making a foolish and poor choices in life. And without a clear conviction embedded into our minds and into our hearts, we might not be able to respond in a way that would be pleasing to God. I want you to notice Joseph's response was to refuse the offer. He refused to be tempted by Potiphar's wife, but that did not stop her. So then, her urge was to take he was urging her to take a long look at her invitation, at what she had just offered him. And he said, really, what do they have to gain from this? Now for her, it was just a little harmless pleasure. But for Joseph, everything was on the line. Count the cost. His life, his character, his integrity, his walk with God. So he challenges her to look at what she was asking him to do. See, he first challenges her to look at the privilege of authority her husband had given him. Potiphar had trusted him with everything that he had, including his wife. In return, Joseph had given him the best that he had, his trust. But he also demonstrated that he served as a loyal slave. He was good. He was a good steward in everything that had been placed into his hands. And Potiphar had gave his stamp of approval on him by trusting him and putting everything into his hands. And Joseph did not want to jeopardize that trust. See, Potiphar's approval also gave him something else to hold on to. You think about this. Because Joseph had never asked to be sold into slavery into Egypt. He never asked one time to be Potiphar's slave. And if he was given a chance to go home, then he would choose to go home to be with his father into the land of Canaan. But that chance had never been given to him. So he chose to make the best of this difficult situation. And as a result, God had blessed him with a good life. And he didn't want to gamble what God had given him, what God had provided for him. He just didn't want to throw that away and end up losing everything over a simple mistake. In verse 9 it says, There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Notice that he challenges her to look at her relationship with her husband. Now, she wanted to lie with him for a moment. So he wanted her to realize that they had taken a vow of marriage that was for life, to be one. And he brings up the need to see herself as his master's wife. by reminding her of the limited reach of authority that had been given to him. He said, "There is none greater in the house than I." Joseph was the most powerful person in Potiphar's house. Why? Because his master had not kept anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. He had given him a limit that he should not cross that line. Joseph could do whatever he wanted except one thing that she wanted him to do, and to cross that line. That one thing that she wanted was to break his trust by throwing it all away for a moment. So Joseph had no choice but to view this affair with her as nothing less than a great wickedness. See, the devil presented Adam and Eve with a choice in the garden to eat of the tree that was forbidden to eat from. And you can bet that Satan will tell you everything that sounds good, tastes good, looks good, but he don't show you the other side of the coin. Look, he can be deceiving, distasteful, and it leaves us separated from God. Joseph challenges her to look at the way that God viewed the invitation to him. Now for her, naturally, it was to satisfy a sexual desire. But for God, it was something totally different. Infidelity violated his way, and it broke his heart. So for Joseph, it was nothing less than sin against God. Why? Because Joseph walked with God. Walking with God had taught him great values of living holy and being set apart from a world that is full of sin. So by accepting her invitation, it would have threatened his position with his master and violated the sanctuary of their marriage. But on top of that, it would have left a broken relationship with God. In verse 10 it says, "And it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her, to lie by her, or to be with her." When Joseph challenged Potiphar's wife, it did not stop her from coming to him every day. She kept on pushing herself onto him every day, and this was something that he could expect from her, to come to him every day. She was consistent every day. He hearkened not unto her desires. I want you to know today that Satan don't give up either. He's waiting for that one chance that you're weak. She asked him over and over to lie down on the bed just next to her. So by lying and being in the bed with her would allow him to drop his guard and then eventually give in to her desires. If she could get him that far, then she could persuade him to go a little farther with her. See, Satan will always lure us out just enough that we think we're all right, everything's okay, and before you know it, you've crossed the line that separates us from God. Sin separates us spiritually and physically from God. So by refusing her daily attempts to seduce him, Joseph proved his remarkable faith and strength in God that came through a daily walk with God long before the temptation had ever came. We got to have that in our life. We got to have that daily walk with God so that we can overcome those pitfalls of temptation when they come. And it's through the power of God that allows us to overcome those pitfalls of temptation, to draw us into sin. See, there's no doubt that Satan's hand was on this, but he was no match for the power of God. Verse 11, "And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within." Again, Joseph went to do his work, to do his business, and eventually there was none of the men of the house there in the home. It's always key to have someone with you. that you're never alone when you're alone with a man or a woman, child, because when you are, you leave the door open for the devil to set you up for trouble. He says, the devil will come and he says, oh, you can keep that a secret. It won't hurt no one. No one will find out. Paul said in Corinthians 6:18-20, flee fornication. Every sin that a man doth is without the body. He that committeth fornication sins against his own body. What? Know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God. Listen today. We must literally remove ourselves from the pitfalls of temptation as quick as possible. It's a way that we can break free from the hold of sinful temptations in our life. Up to this point, we see that Joseph had tolerated the daily attempts from his master's wife. He may have tried to keep a safe distance as possible. He might have tried to keep servants around him at all times during the day. But on this day, it came to pass that Joseph had to go inside of the house. There was no servants to be found. You know, Satan was always making plans as well. There was no servants to be found. The absence could have been planned by Potiphar's wife. Satan is always planning, see, to have no one around, an empty house. She may have set the bait that she could finally trap Joseph. That way he would be vulnerable, all alone. No one could testify on his behalf of the actions that he would take. Joseph was a man of integrity. He was honest, he was loyal, and he walked with God. All of those things, integrity and honesty, loyal, a walk with God, don't stop Satan trying to destroy us and to make us no longer useful for God. Job was an upright man with God. Never stopped Satan from taking everything that was important into his life, and even sickness in his life. See, James 1:12-15 and 16 says, blessed is a man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to him that love him. Then when lust has conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. Listen, he says, do not err, my beloved brother. 1 Peter 1:7 says that the trying of your faith being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearings of Jesus Christ. When we come through these trials and these pitfalls of temptations, we can come out of those with praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ, knowing that Jesus walked with us in the midst of our problems. In verse 12, and she caught him by his garments, saying, lie with me, and left his garment, and he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got him out. Once Joseph was in the house, she made her move. She assaulted him. Her lust had turned her heart into something like a rage. She had been refused over and over again. That Hebrew word for caught, it gives us the idea of clutching onto something or grasping it with a cruel and evil purpose in mind. She had caught him by his garments. This would have been an article of clothing that the Egyptians would wear as an outer garment. They would wear due to the climate of the desert. It would keep them cool while they worked. Most of the typical garments in this time period would have been a thin cloth made of white lining that would cover a man like a bathrobe, a long bathrobe, all the way out to your wrist. Now she had made the second move by verbally saying, lie with me. Just lie with me with the intentions of seducing him to commit adultery with her. And third of all, I want you to notice Joseph's response the way that God tells us to respond. To flee, to run away, to get out as quick as possible. This is exactly what he done. He left in such a hurry that he left his garment in her hand. He fled and got him out. See, he ran away from temptation. He made a quick decision in his mind and his heart that served as a great example for God's people. Paul told Timothy to run from lust. He says in 2 Timothy 2:22, flee also youthful lust, and follow righteousness, faith, charity, peace with them that call on the Lord from a pure heart. So by running away, we make a wise decision in our life, because if we hang around and we make problems worse, then it's tougher to resist those temptations, those pitfalls, and therefore we fall into a trap or a pit that Satan has laid in front of us. So for Joseph to escape from his garments, when she grabbed his garments, it only left her with an empty garment and angry. Sin will always leave us empty and angry. So she made up a story, a lie that would send Joseph to jail and put Joseph into the same position again that he once was. He lost everything that he had gained since he came to Egypt. He lost his position of authority, his freedom to move around, and the loyalty of the Egyptians. He also lost his respect, his reputation, his trust. He had become nothing more than a criminal who was in prison, accused of rape. But listen today, I want you to know today that Joseph's decision to run was the right decision in God's eyes. God had a plan and purpose for his life. And sometimes we'll find ourselves suffering for the decisions, even when we've made the right call, we've made the right decision, and our punishment might seem to be unjust instead of a reward for our loyalty. And that decision should never tempt us from resisting temptation. God has set up standards in which we should follow, no matter what the world may think of us or what they may expect of us. Why? Because God will always protect us from injustice. We must have faith in God's plan, that God's plan will work out. He says in Romans 8:28, and know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are called according to his purpose. We must have a sense of awareness in our life in keeping with his plan, because God knows what's happening in our life. He knows all about us, and we should focus on what's out at stake in our life. What's the cost? Look, today we should not simply focus on what we're running from, but what we're running towards. The pursuit of God is far more appealing to have hope and peace and love and forgiveness and eternal life than to be separated from God's love and to live in a sinful world full of sin and death. Be like Joseph. Count the cost. Is it worth it? Can you justify it? Will God be happy with my decision? God bless you. Thank you.